Hi. Okay, let's just start a meeting. First of all, just a couple items for logistics. The North America KubeCon, shall we apply for again the intro and deep dive session, or we just combine with the sig-security one? Any thoughts?
If we can combine it with the sig-security, I feel like they've not scheduled them well enough in the past. I don't know. Does anyone else have thoughts?
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay, I will reach out to Sarah and other folks, see how they will arrange. So today we have Shooting coming over and give a rather in-depth introduction of the new Kyverno project. So let me stop sharing, and Shooting, I think you can go ahead, just share the desktop.
Let me share my desktop.
No. Okay, great.
Can you see it now?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So today I'll have Jim and Chief, which are my colleagues, to have this presentation about the Kyverno. And let me switch over to Jim to start.
All right. Hey, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to present. So just in terms of what we were going to go through, and we can, of course, keep this very interactive, is we want to kind of cover the motivations for why we started this project, what we're trying to accomplish, of course, and then we'll do a deep dive demo and also cover the architecture. So Shooting is going to walk us through what the policy language, what it supports. We'll see that in action, and then we'll also look at, Shiv will cover the architecture and some of the details and a few things that we're thinking of and have questions on for the team. So just in terms of, why Kyverno and why we started this and what we're trying to accomplish. So first off, a little bit of background, like at Nirmata, we work with very traditional enterprises who are trying to embrace cloud native technologies. And our primary role, the primary focus of our product is for the cluster operators. So typically these are system administrators, they're folks who are familiar with like mid-tier type technologies in enterprises, maybe like databases, middleware, etc. And now they're adopting Kubernetes, and they're providing Kubernetes as a service to internal teams. So our main motivation was to make it extremely simple. Of course, as we all know, Kubernetes itself has a pretty steep learning curve. So we did not want, and these are not software engineers. We wanted somebody who is a cluster operator and administrator to be able to fully understand and write a policy very easily without having to learn a new language or a new syntax. We also wanted to make, of course, policies very easy to manage through any standard tool within Kubernetes, as well as the results and the outputs of the policy engine to be very simple as well. Another thing, of course, as we've heard, Kubernetes is, of course, a framework to build new frameworks. So as we're seeing an explosion of CRs out there, we want to make sure that the policy engine can handle any CR without too much effort. And then finally, it's not just about validating configurations, but also being able to mutate as well as generate. So a lot of, you'll see there's some commonality between how Kustomize operates and what we have done. And that sort of drove a lot of the motivation for some of the features. So those are just some at a very, again, introductory level of what we're trying to do. And certainly open to ideas, suggestions as we get deeper and as you get familiar with the project. But now Shooting will go through a deeper dive on exactly what we support, how you would write Kyverno policies, and how we have tried to keep this as simple as possible.
Okay, thanks, Jim. So today I'm going to briefly explain what the Kyverno policy is and what are the different type of rules we support. So first of all, the Kyverno policy is basically a set of ordered rules. And for each of the rule, you can have the unique name, and you can have the optional message to describe what this policy is for. And for each of the rule, you can have the resource, like you can select on what kind of resource you want this policy to apply with. For example, you can define the name, even with the wildcard format, or the kind, or even can select on namespace or the label selector. And currently we support 3 different types of rules, which are mutate rule, validate rule, and generate rule. So this is the overall view of the Kyverno policy. And like I mentioned before, you can have a number of rules in a single policy. And for each of the rule, you can have this resource field. Like for example, this policy, I'm saying that I want to apply this rule to deployments, default set, and daemon set. And also you can match the name and the selector based on the labels of the expressions. And followed by that, you can define the different type of rules below this resource session. So let's jump a little bit deep to each of the rules. First, mutate rule. We kind of support 2 different styles of the mutate rule. First is the JSON patch, which allows the user to specify the JSON patch and configure and updates the configurations of your Kubernetes clusters. And also we support the overlay styles for the user to describe the intent or the requirement of the configurations. And some of the features we support in this overlay pattern, for example, with this anchor character, I'm saying that whatever the name is matched to the secure or something, I want to replace the port to 6443. And this star here works as regular expression. And for another one, like I have this plus anchor, which I'm going to say, if the port is not defined in your incoming resources, I want this port number by default set to 6443. Okay, and comes to the validate rule. Similarly, we support these overlay patterns and lets you to validate the desired state of your incoming resources or even the existing resources. And by doing that, let's take a look at this validate block. So this validate rule is to say, whenever I want to validate the one of the label name called app is required in the incoming resource. And here I used this pattern, the question mark and this star to map to say that I want this field exist. And also we support some of the operators like greater than or less than. It is helpful when you want to, for example, check the health check, like the CPU, like the liveness probe, the success threshold, or the volume size. You want to limit some of the volume size not exist, for example, 1 gig. Okay, and come to the generate rule. Basically, it is triggered when the namespace is created. And you can use this generate rule to create some of the default resources of along with the namespace creation. Let's take a look at this generation block. So for this rule, basically I'm saying that when the namespace is created, I want to generate this network policy by default, which is to deny all the traffic. And also you cannot only generate some resource of this rule, also you can copy the existing resource from your Kubernetes cluster into this new namespace. Okay, and those are the basic examples of what the Kyverno policy looks like, or how you can use the Kyverno policy. And to summarize, this is the overall syntax, or I would say languages we support in the mutate rule or the validate rule. And also we support the wildcard across the policy. Okay, let me give you a quick demo of how Kyverno policy works. And with the Kyverno, we support some of the features to report the info of the validation and the mutation. So let's take a look at the policy first. This is the validate rule, and I want to validate some of the security context of the deployment scheduled in this namespace. Let's go to my terminal, and I already have the Kyverno deployed. I can show you. Okay, so for a quick info, if you go to our GitHub page and say getting started, here is the installation document. And simply you can import this YAML to your cluster, and then Kyverno controller will be up and running. Okay, and then let's try to apply the policy. First, since it's a CR in Kubernetes, so you can use kubectl get policy to check what are the policies in your cluster. And now let's try to create the resource in this namespace. So you can see this request is blocked because failed to validate some of the patterns. And even more, we give you the path of which field is actually validating this policy. And let's go back to the policy and check. So either you can change this allow privilege escalation to false to be consistent with policy, or we have another feature called, you can enable this flag called validation failure action on audit, which is basically to report on any of the failure. Oh, by the way, we have the failure events generate with this creation block. So if you describe policy, you can see there's an event called request blocked because this rule is actually blocking the creation of this resource. Okay, and then since I enable this flag, let's change the policy. And then try to create the resource again. Let's have nginx -protect. Okay, now, so this time you can see the request has go through and the resource is created. Let's take a look at the policy side. Since the flag is to report what kind of resource you can be reported by this policy, is we are reporting this violation as the sub resource of this policy manifest. And here you can map to the exact resource which has the violation, and also same information about the failure. And let's say if you're the application owner and you don't have like the access to the overall cluster-wide policy, what you can check is in your deployment in the product namespace. And let's check the manifest. And in this annotation field of the deployment, we will show you this Kyverno policy. The status is failed. And you have the details about the failure from the application owner's point of view. Okay, let me switch back. Also, we have a few of best practices available on our GitHub page. Feel free to check it out. And if you have any questions or the cases you want us to support, you can go to the issue page and file a ticket there. Okay, and let me stop sharing and switch to Shiv. He will show us the overall architecture of Kyverno and some of the implementation details.
All right, thanks, Sharing. So just to go over the high-level components, how it really works internally. So basically, you have the policy engine, which acts like an interface to allow you to process the three types of rules, which is the mutate, validate, and the generate. Then what we really are doing is the whole part where we control of resource creation, or do we block it, or we leverage the dynamic admission control. The first on the resource, and the second is basically on the custom resource, which is the policy. If a policy is removed, we want to make sure that the annotations which the resource had should also be cleaned up. Then we have the controller to look for the policy CR, and also the namespace, because a namespace, the generation rules specify a particular resource is supposed to be created after a namespace is generated. So that's where the namespace generator controller comes out. And then the other part is the reporting components, where we use the events on the resource and the policy to notify, and also a policy violation, which is actually we are using the status sub resource in the CR as of now, and then the annotation of the resource. And also, since we can define policy on new CRs, we are using a dynamic client to leverage that. So the dynamic admission controller, as it's pretty, as you might all know, we have the mutating and the validating admission webhooks, which basically interact with the policy engine and do the decision making. Then we have the policy engine. Now in the policy engine, the interface is pretty simple. You just provide your raw resource, the resource that's supposed to be operated on, and what kind of an operation do you want, the mutation, generation, or validation, and the policy as well. So it's just a common interface, allows you to interact from various trigger points. Then we have the small CLI utility. So now this policy engine that we have can also be used offline to just provide a resource YAML and a policy YAML and get a response. How does it really apply? So just to play around and test before you actually apply it on the cluster, sort of a dry run. Next, as I talked about, the controller, the policy controller, which looks at the policies. And what it also does is whenever a new policy is applied, and that policy is also applicable on existing resources, so we evaluate the existing resources as well. At that point, we do not modify the resource if we have a mutation rule, but rather consider it as a violation, so that the resource owner knows that there is something that they have to correct if they want to comply with the policy. The namespace controller again looks at the generation rules. The moment a namespace is generated, create the corresponding resources, either a new resource or clone from an existing resource. And then reporting, what we have is the events, more like a state log to see what's basically happening on a resource, which all policies have been applied, and what is the behavior, is it successful, failure, things like that. And then annotations as well, as Shooting mentioned. If you don't have access to the cluster-wide policy, you can look up the resource and see which policy is applied and which rule is successfully applied. And if there is a failure, what's the error involved. For violations, again, it's the status sub-resource. The reason we chose the status as the status sub-resource for the violations was just for a simple scenario, but this could also be the policy violations itself could be a custom resource in itself, which is a parent to a policy, and have label selectors to connect them. Then finally, coming to the dynamic client. So the use of dynamic client allows us to operate on new CRs that are being added into the cluster, so you can define policies on them. You're not restricted to the type client. And because of this, we operate on the unstructured format. Currently, we only support one version per resource. This is again to just keep it simple for now, because we query the preferred resources, but we could also support multiple versions. So if a deployment has multiple versions and they are being used at the same time, you could have policy specifically policy in this policy. You can specify which group version you really want to enforce this on. So that's basically it from the architecture. Now, Jim, you want to go over the next steps and how we want to.
Yeah, so really just to summarize, if you go to the next slide, Shiv. Yeah, what we're kind of talking about, and what Shooting and Shiv covered is, basically we want to keep the policy engine very abstracted and usable in different ways. But of course, the inputs into it currently are mostly through the webhooks, the validate, the mutate triggers. We also, like Shiv mentioned, we're watching for namespace changes. And there will be other triggers that we potentially can add in the future. And the idea is to operate on the raw resource, and the outputs are, again, we're creating JSON patches, the updated resources, events, and violations, right? So really, Shiv, next slide. So what we want to kind of think about, and this is a question for everyone, is there value in starting to standardize some of this input and output? And would love to, again, your feedback and thoughts on that. So that way, just like we have other pluggable components in Kubernetes, policy engines also become pluggable. And I'm sure there'll be other policy engines folks want to write in different languages, etc. So this allows a framework to do that. So that's all we had in terms of presentation, but happy to answer any questions, go deeper in any area, or even, if you want, we can set up follow-on sessions as needed. We do have on the Kubernetes Slack, you can also ask questions on the Kyverno channel, or certainly on our GitHub.
Okay. Questions? Anyone?
I have a lot of questions, but if someone wants to go first, I'll wait if anyone has quick ones. All right, cool. I will just start asking away.
Okay.
Some of my questions. It's cool. I like that you mentioned specifically like that there's some overlap with like customize and some of the more application level sort of validation stuff. One quick question, do you have like customers using this in production currently, or is it just?
Yeah, so the evolution of this is we had an implementation of this in Nirmata. So Nirmata works as an out-of-band management platform, and we had implemented a policy engine which applied policies in Nirmata, and I guess SCRDs and other machinery in Kubernetes became more formal. The idea and the intent was to always move this down into the cluster, which is what Kyverno, that's how it emerged.
Okay, so you have some existing stuff and that you're kind of pulling it out.
Right.
Cool. One thing, the generate functionality. You said that's on namespace creation. Are there any other hooks? Is it generic for any sort of event, or was it very specific to generating resources for namespace creation?
So currently we're watching for namespace creation, but there's nothing preventing that logic from being run on different triggers. The reason why we went with namespaces initially, the use case there was really around virtual clusters, right? So to create a namespace with default policies for the network policy, resource quotas, things like that. And that's what the use case we're pursuing initially. But if there are other use cases, that's what we'd like to learn and hear. And Shiv, any thoughts on like how that could be extended from the namespace controller to other triggers?
Well, one for real quick on the namespace triggers, are you also tuned in with the multi-tenancy working group? I know they've had some, they're dealing with more of the very specific kind of problem of more like virtual clusters and such. And I think there've been some proposals on like namespace population.
Okay.
I don't know where. I feel like I've almost been out for the summer for both this group and the other one. But definitely you might want to check that out. They might be interested in that sort of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have been trying to keep up, but I think, like you said, there's been a lot of changes and a lot of proposals there. So I don't know what the latest is on that.
Cool. Then where do you, well, one thing I was thinking of when you're saying like the generate, I was like, oh, that could be interesting if you had, for instance, sort of random hooks of this gets created and then it creates a bunch of other resources as a trigger. Besides
Right.
almost like a crazy amount of power, maybe too much power.
But
that would definitely expand your use of like a custom resource rather than, it's almost like you wouldn't need both mutation and a more generic generation. Does that make sense?
So if I understood correctly, I think you're saying like if any, like based on any type of object or resource that gets created, to be able to use that as a trigger.
Yeah, well, I was kind of thinking about like your mutation and validation are pretty standard coming from like the webhooks. Yeah. So the generator I was like, oh, that's very kind of unique.
Right. Yeah, and there, and again, that we do this in Nirmata a lot is like we have policies which provide like templates to get things started, right? Because there's just so much boilerplate otherwise, like, and especially on namespace creation. But yes, that could be useful also for other resources.
I mean, as I said, that would be very powerful, so I would be careful, but which sort of goes with you actually mentioned that you want to be somewhat abstract. Most of the things I hear, these, of the common wisdom is, warning people not to prematurely abstract or, get in over your head. What makes you want to be abstract, and why do you think that this is the right place to do that, as opposed to being more kind of concrete the way perhaps some like policies have been before this?
Yeah, so I think it's just observing, looking at other projects and things in the community, of course. There does seem to be, like a lot of us end up doing the same thing in different ways. So whatever we can, of course, to share that commonality and say, okay. So, and also from the user perspective, right? I mean, it's always best to bake a bigger pie, right, so to speak. So if we can have some standardization on what policy outputs should look like, then perhaps we're more likely to have, more users, just like we've seen on the networking and the storage side. These are fairly now stable abstractions where you can choose which plugin you want to use for a different cluster. So similarly, if we think about standardizing the inputs and outputs, I think then just policies become more mainstream, because regardless of which particular implementation you choose or which vendor you choose to go with, the Kubernetes behaviors remain standard. So that was the thinking, and it's very rough at this point, honestly, but so definitely open to feedback and thoughts.
Interesting. Another thing I was wondering is how there was a mention of if then else, but it seemed like it was a little bit closer to pattern matching. Is that more correct? Because I'm trying to figure out how powerful you're talking about, from if you have full if else recursion, as for instance OPA has a full Turing complete language versus customize and overlays are the least programmatic. Where in that line is the power of your system?
Yes, so currently it's really just a conditional. So it's just if then we don't support even the else clause, because we're trying to be extremely minimal in terms of adding anything more. So unless we can think of a real world use case, we've been kind of restrained in what we're adding. So yeah, it's not a full language. It's not intended to be. It's more like you exactly said, pattern matching, which sysadmins and other administrators are fairly used to using command line tools like that. And we wanted to be careful in choosing syntax also, which looks very familiar and logical.
Cool. You mentioned that please also, anyone else, please jump in. As I said, I have some questions, but I don't want to be hogging the time here. But you mentioned possibly more actions or kind of the hooks besides validate, mutate, and generate. Why are you thinking of expanding along that dimension? Have you found certain limitations with the 3 that you've chosen?
No, not particularly. I think it was more, I had read somewhere, maybe it was on one of the forums or perhaps in one of the document, that there was some intent of, trying to go to additional triggers. So yeah, for what we are, the use cases we're thinking of right now, they're all related around managing configurations and not other types of policy actions, right? So these triggers are quite sufficient.
Okay.
And in addition to what you described, we just picked namespaces, or we went with that right now because there was again a very concrete use case which we've seen customers want. If we have other resource triggers, to add, that can be done.
Have you had performance considerations in your experience as running, maybe not as the separated out, but within your platform? Has that been a concern at all?
So
very famously also Cloudflare, pushed a rule that brought down a lot of the internet because of that. Is that an issue?
It is a concern, right? And Shiv and Juting and I were discussing, we have an open issue before we go GA where we want a profile, and we have, there's definitely room for optimization. So we've been more focused on completing some of the common features. But certainly that's a concern. also handling errors properly, like what should be the behavior if a policy engine is not responsive, right? It's a interesting question. Like, should configuration be allowed or should it be blocked? And but that could lead to situations just like, I think, shooting, you saw one problem, right, where some of the cluster updates, etc., could also be blocked, right? So there are valid concerns, and I think at this point we don't have answers for those, but more we're interested in learning and sharing and seeing if others have seen some of these and what could be, again, best practices around them.
Cool. And then last question, for the, you're kind of talking about standardizing with the community and such. Do you have specific pieces that you think would be, from your experience, would be the right place to start on that kind of standardization?
Yeah, so Shiv, if you want to go back to the prior slide you were sharing. So certainly it seems like if you look at the projects out there, the admission controller portion of it, right? Like where you're listening to some of these webhooks and then invoking based on these logics. So again, I don't know, we need to think about whether it's fully worthwhile standardizing on those. But then the other output is, of course, the what comes out of the policy engine, right? So, and I think that would be more interesting to Kubernetes users because they're more interested in getting the report or the results of a policy in very standard ways, regardless of what's applying the policy or which triggers a particular engine may support. So I think, yeah, both of those ends, the inputs and the outputs, is what we were thinking. And yeah, I don't know. So those would be it, really. And then the other thing that Shiv mentioned, which is a very interesting point, and we kind of debated about also internally as we were looking at some of this implementation, is that using a dynamic client and being able to operate on any resource, right? That was extremely important, and it is a little bit more painful, and there's still things there like we need to sort out, like how do we handle different API groups of the same resource type, so things like that. But it definitely seems like, again, things that could could provide value in terms of standardizing those behaviors.
Okay, cool. Is anyone on this call keeping up with, like, was it the component working group? Was it what I'm talking? Anyone know what I'm talking about?
We have component working.
A component something
Really?
standardization working group. I think they were more like not necessarily specifically policy, but I think it's kind of similar to like pod specs that are shared around, but making sure that, and they're concentrating, I think, on like cloud providers and Ingress and all the other ones that kind of could differ. But I haven't been keeping up with it, so I wasn't sure if that's the right place to talk about look into maybe some of the standardizing input outputs.
Yeah, and also we have a like long-running cloud native policy white paper. If you guys are interested, feel free to contribute. And there's also a long-running idea of introduce a cloud a container policy interface. similar to what you've mentioned, like similar to the storage network runtime interface that hopefully standardize the input and output of the policy engine.
Oh, cool. Is there a proposal already on that?
No, I just crafted out a very simple template like ages ago. Yeah, and like if you have any ideas on that front, I think you can. So I will put the link on the meeting minutes so that you know where to look at. Okay.
Awesome.
All
right.
Yeah, just some information. Any other questions from other people?
But just a comment, there's also the Gatekeeper project that's, I haven't been on those calls for a while, but that was another effort, I think, to standardize constraints and policy libraries and then managing all the policy through the Kubernetes mission controller. So maybe, I'm not sure if you've looked at that or if it's relevant, but something you might want to look at.
I think we have links in the meeting notes, right?
Yeah, we
have looked at that. I think Shiv, you've also done some research on that, and we were discussing. So feel free to jump in if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. So the Gatekeeper is sort of right now inclined towards using OPA as a policy engine, but a few things that we really wanted to emphasize on was the one that you see on the left is the triggers, having a decoupled engine, and the reporting components. And one major difference is the use of dynamic client, while the Gatekeeper uses Cube Builder, which sort of restricts them to the typed version. So you only are restricted to the client Go version that your binary has. But as we do updates, as we add more new CRs, or even a resource goes from a version change, you don't need a new binary for your policy engine. You could use the dynamic client because we always query the Kubernetes API, Kube API server to give us a list of resources that it's already registered with. So that makes us flexible in comparison.
Is that an implementation difference more so?
True, but so if you look at the type client, it sort of keeps it really simple for you to use. But the moment we start using dynamic client, it's a bit trickier to operate on all the types of resources because you are working on an unstructured type. So, but the thing is, it doesn't put us any limitations on. So we are not limited by the typed versions. Now we can use different CRs and leverage it for other features. But essentially, yes, it's a limit implementation detail.
Do you use some of the other standard things like the namespace selectors and label selectors? Those seem to be common across things.
Yes, so if you look at the policy, the first part where we define the resource description, you can either use the name with wildcards or you can directly specify the label selectors which we have. So we haven't written anything of our own. It's the same label selector format. So it's just a way of leveraging what we have and providing them in a very simplified way.
Yeah, also we match by namespaces as well, right? So you could, the other thing we're adding in, which will be in our next release, is exclusions. So one common pattern we're seeing is operators may want to enforce a security policy across the cluster, but exclude a couple of namespaces, right? So to make things like that extremely simple.
I believe some of the API machinery people have been very hesitant against kind of exclusions. You know, like RBAC is additive only, for instance. There isn't a kind of deny rule for mostly performance.
Okay, yeah, that might be interesting.
I don't know 100% though.
Just to add, that's true. Like if we add exclusions, yes, it's definitely going to impact the performance based on how, because we, at the end of the day, we have, again, you make use of the API machinery components, but the option is you have an option for the user to be more flexible. That's sort of the intent from the start, to keep it sort of simple. And if you have some scenarios, you could do that.
One thing I missed, the rules are ordered within the policy resource, correct?
Yes.
And then if more than one policy applies to the same resource, how are they ordered?
As of now, the order of policies is the creation timestamp. So the policy that was generated first is being applied right now. But as Jim mentioned, we have some profiling issues, and as per the profiling, we want to again sort of revisit and see how we can give it more freedom, or even provide like a hierarchical structure if that really helps in scaling the policies.
Yeah, and the intent was the reason why we have rules and policies that users could group rules together and order them, so that's completely in their control. But typically, there's no assumed order across policies. Now, we could, and we had talked about adding in some dependency and ordering, but we decided not to at the moment, again, until if there are good use cases for that can be done.
Yeah, we have Rita from the Gatekeeper project now on the call, and
hey everyone.
Hi, Rita.
yeah. So I think as Erica suggested, you guys are like more than welcome to reach out to Gatekeeper project, see like what are the common grounds.
Okay.
That you can collaborate, and yeah, they are really doing some fascinating stuff. So yeah.
Yeah, would love to. Okay.
Yeah, please join the Tuesday calls if you can.
Okay.
Yeah. And Amrita, can you give like a quick update on the security policy we mentioned a couple of weeks ago? Any progress?
Yeah, I just started implementing the PSP policies in as Gatekeeper constraints and constraint templates. I started that effort, but taking some time because of other priorities. But hopefully, once it's at a good state, I mean, it is really, really rough right now. There's no unit test or anything. So I was hoping that once it's at a good stopping point, I can share with the community. But the repo is open, so anyone can go and take a look. Just know that it's really, really rough right now.
Okay.
Yeah, I started playing around with it a little bit. I'm a little bit newer to Gatekeeper, so part of it was just understanding more how it works.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. It's not meant to be like an end state, right? Like, but rather like something as a reference, right?
Yeah. One thing I've learned is finalizers can be very annoying when you play around with things. I don't know if anyone else has had that issue.
Yeah. We also, so in Gatekeeper project, we also talked about better way to, like there's an issue out there where we're talking about, should we go ahead and remove finalizers? But obviously they're there for good reasons. So it's a debate, like everything else. Yeah. Here's the repo, and anybody wants to check it out. But yeah, I'll keep working on this going forward. And in terms of the Gatekeeper project, so the mutation stuff is still being developed right now. There's a design doc out there if anybody's interested. All the docs and design discussions the links are in the meeting notes from Gatekeeper project. And then also we finished designing the dry run. So basically dry run policies before you enforce them in the cluster. So we finished designing that. So I just need to start implementing. But yeah, looking for feedback and just general questions or anything. Feel free to reach out on Slack.
Okay. Thank you. And we have like 8 minutes. And Robert, do you want to share with the formal verification discussion update?
Sure. Yeah, I think we don't need that much time. I'll direct everyone to the repo I put on the Google Doc that has my current consolidation of all the discussions we've had. If I've omitted anything, please feel free to comment there directly or on Slack. And certainly it's an open collaborative document. So if anyone wants to add something, before I create the PR to the sig-security repo, as much feedback as I could get would be great. But anyway, to summarize, I think where I've gotten, kind of listening over the last couple of months to the discussion, talking to different folks, and of course we had that call with AWS on, and they explained their, oh, thanks. I think this is where our efforts could be spent best, is to define a way to formalize the requirements for a security policy, and then extract from that, an actual formal statement of what that policy specification is, something that can be machine checked against a solver of some sort, a model checker, and that would produce some answer to the human. The human wants to know something like, is my network reachable from the public internet? Is this particular subnet reachable from another subnet? And if so, how or why? On the user side, does this user have access to this S3 bucket, right? Or volume in the case of Kubernetes? These are the kind of use cases that I've seen out there. So Amazon and Microsoft have published the most on this. Amazon has two tools, Zelkova and Tiros. Zelkova being kind of their IAM user role permission tool, and Tiros being their network policy role tool. So the basic idea, I think, behind both of them is really they have a specification. So in the case of Zelkova, I believe it's the IAM JSON itself is not only the policy, so a particular instantiation of the specification, but they're actually using that as a specification itself. So kind of an analogous way of doing that in Kubernetes might be, I want to specify a policy in Rego, I might actually use Rego itself as the formal specification. And then translate that into a set of SMT logical formulas that I can run through an SMT solver like Z3, or any of the other SMT solvers that are out there. and then that will validate whether the particular question, the particular query I'm asking is satisfiable or not. So that seems to be the model that everybody's doing, everybody being Amazon and Microsoft. I think we could probably emulate that, use their best practices as a guide, and then tailor a tool similar to Zelkova and similar to Tiros for a pure Kubernetes cloud delivery. So I think to get concrete, that would be the recommendation I would have, is that we basically create a project for delivering that tool and defining what that, we have some options, and you guys can read through some of my thoughts. We can use a completely separate formal specification language, something like Z, something like TLA Plus or Alloy. We could kind of emulate what AWS did and use the policy language itself as the specification. Microsoft, I think, has this notion of a contract, which they don't explicitly document, but I think it's probably some quasi-Boolean formula notation. I think they had in their white paper and their published paper, they had kind of a academic version of it. So we could certainly use that as inspiration. So there'd be some specific implementation decisions to make. But I think, again, the general formula would be pick a way to codify what a policy is trying to do. Compare that to an actual policy specification that the solver could read, and then the solver will generate an answer, whether it's been satisfied or not. And that tool, or the tool chain, maybe a more appropriate definition, that tool chain could be delivered to the Kubernetes community as a tool they could use. That's it in a nutshell.
Looks awesome.
Yeah, I was gonna say, this is super awesome write-up.
Yeah. Just one question. So if we can directly evaluate data log based like the OPA Rego policies, right?
Yeah, so data log has a long history of being used as a formal specification language. And Rego derives from, at least in design, from data log. What I'm waiting for clarification from Tim over at the OPA project is whether some of those propositional logic capabilities are actually in Rego. Even data log itself, there have been some forks in the academic world where people have created their own variations of data log to have more robust expressive power to be able to capture. So it's an open question to me, at least, whether Rego has all of the capabilities we would need, or if they could be easily added, or well, even if they could be added with difficulty. My gut says yes, because being data log-ish, it should be pretty straightforward. Then it's just, I guess, more of a question of bang for the buck. Is it easier to use something that's already there somewhere, and or is it easier, better to enhance Rego, maybe kind of more formally logical Rego, or maybe we find out that Rego has everything we need today. I don't know that answer yet.
Okay. Awesome. This is really awesome.
I guess the last point I'll make is that I think the basic premise of this, and I think certainly as someone who's used Amazon and Google, and not as much on the Azure Microsoft side, but and then Kubernetes, policy is extraordinarily difficult to write at scale, and when you've got lots of competing priorities and resources and user groups. So I think the overarching goal of this is that humans are bad at writing policy, and they need a tool that at the very least validates that the policy they have written is correct, and does that very robustly.
Yeah. Oh. Okay, I think you just you can just PR it right away, and yeah, let's see folks from the sig-security. I think there's a lot of folks also interested in policy there. So let's see how they think.
Great, I will do that.
Yep. Okay, any other item we want to go over for today's meeting? If not, we can conclude the meeting now, and I will upload the recording as usual. Okay, thank you guys.
Hold on, I think really quick.
Okay.
Should we confirm, are we going to meet next week? Should we move to every other week? Or there's also a request for a European-friendly time?
Yeah, but the guy hasn't replied to me yet, so
okay.
I'm okay moving to like every 2 weeks, or yeah, depending on you guys.
I think every 2 weeks could work. If we needed to increase the cadence, if there needed to be drill downs on other topics, we could do that ad hoc.
That would work for me, at least for the summer.
Okay. Cool.
So then our next meeting would be August 7th.
Okay. Yeah. I will modify the calendar. Okay.
Cool.
Oh, and I will try to invite the cloud custodian team over if possible.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's another policy project. Okay. Thank you guys. Let's meet the week after next week.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Okay. Okay. Bye bye.
Thanks, all.
Bye.
Bye bye.